morning, everybody. How are you doing today? It's bright. So last night I went to the opening of the 94th season of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. Was anyone there? Nobody? Well, let me tell you, it was spectacular. For a pretty hippy-dippy city, we have a world-class symphony orchestra. It was a lot of fun. So apologies in advance if I start conducting you, because it's still with me a little bit. But we're going to talk about today how I joined this fight for women's human rights in Afghanistan back in 1996. And two of the really important lessons that I've learned there in the last 16 years. One of which is that the right to literacy, the right to education, is a stepping stone to all other basic human rights. And the second is that human rights are universal. So we'll get to that, but first I'll take you back to 1996 to get started. Remember the 90s? So I was starting grade 9 in 1996 in a West Coast bedroom community. And I was starting to want to wear tight pants and blue eyeshadow and became a kind of menacing specter of teenage subversion to my distraught parents. And I was harping constantly about rights and justice and challenging authority at every turn and my right to stay out late and to dye my hair blue. And so, me being the oldest, my mother, in her efforts to channel all that teenage angst and energy and rage into maybe a more proactive interest in justice and rights, cut out a newspaper article for me one morning and left it on my bed, and I came home from school that afternoon and I picked it up and read it. And at the top of the article is a big black and white photograph of a woman wearing something called a burqa that I'd never seen before. And the story beneath it was reporting of a new militia regime that had come into power in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, called the Taliban. And specifically about the system of edicts that they had imposed on women and girls in particular. And the article said that girls couldn't go to school anymore. Women were not allowed to work outside their home. They weren't even allowed to leave their homes without an immediate male relative as their guardian. They couldn't access medical care because men couldn't treat women in hospitals and clinics, and all the women had been told to stay home from work. Nail polish was banned, makeup, shoes that made noise, white socks, long list of even trivial things that were forbidden. A favorite pastime of Afghans, kite flying, was banned, as you probably know if you've read the book or seen the movie The Kite Runner. Music was banned, pictures of living things, books that were non-religious. All television and radio stations were shut down except for the official Taliban station, Radio Shariat. So life had changed very quickly and suddenly for Afghans, despite the fact that they'd been in war for a long time, and that's in fact where the Taliban came from. They were birthed from war. They were recruited from the huge refugee camps in Pakistan, where there were millions of refugees living. So young men indoctrinated and trained how to use weapons and taught this very extremist, militant version of Islam. And if you broke any of these edicts, the punishments were severe, especially for women. And in Kabul Sports Stadium, which at one time was used in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for co-ed soccer games and parades and university student events, became an execution hall. And women who were accused of so-called moral crimes, prostitution, adultery, or sometimes just for falling in love, were stoned to death or executed by gunshot in the sports stadium in front of thousands of spectators. Criminals or supposed criminals had their hands or feet cut off, and the bodies of those who were executed were hung in the street to scare people. And it worked. People were afraid. And this is not the stuff of a bizarre science fiction movie, although it might sound like that. This was real life for the women and girls of Afghanistan. And at 14, I just couldn't believe that this was happening in the same world that I lived in, a world that until then I had believed to be safe and happy, and where powerful people would intervene when people were being hurt or harmed. But no one was doing anything. And what was even more shocking than what the Taliban were doing to women and girls was that they were getting away with it. There was hardly a word of outcry from Western governments, from the United Nations, and so as a result, the citizens of countries like my own barely knew what was happening. There wasn't a lot of media coverage, And so really the women of Afghanistan grieved alone. And in my 14-year-old naivete, I kept asking, how can this be happening? And I just felt enraged and unsatisfied with doing nothing. And I certainly wouldn't have been able to find Afghanistan on a map at that time. And I didn't know anything about human rights or international law or the human rights movement. But I did understand one key thing, and that was that it was the silence of ordinary people like me that was allowing this to happen. And so I decided to do something, and thus began what my family sometimes calls all Afghanistan all the time, or my life. It meant to be maybe a hobby or a month or 2 month long quick intervention, but suddenly a decade and a half have gone by, and here I am doing the same thing. And my sister often tells me, you sure know a lot about Afghanistan, but not very much about anything else. So that's what I do. And the first thing that I did was to write a petition asking people to condemn what the Taliban were doing and to take action and to ask our government to take action. So I sent it off to to my own government, to the American government, and to the Taliban, actually. They had a fax number on their website. So they didn't answer. But that was the start of it. And it was also the start of my first interaction with cultural relativism. So the idea that nothing is universal, that everything we believe in our culture and our society is constructed. And specifically, cultural relativism will often say that things are a Western construct, ideas that we might have that we believe to be the norm or universal are really just Western ideas, and to each his own. What might seem wrong to one person in one society may not be so in other places. And so when I was taking my petition around asking people to sign it, my science teacher in grade 9 didn't sign it. And he said, it's none of our business how they choose to treat their women. And I couldn't believe my ears. But I got used to hearing this because it's the refrain that has accompanied my work since the very beginning. And that's cultural relativism, that excuse making. And it's very dangerous because it serves us as an excuse to not have to do anything as we live in our own free and privileged society, to not have to extend those freedoms to others or assume that others want them. And so from 1996 onwards, I've been negotiating cultural relativism as I negotiate human rights in Afghanistan. And I think that Afghan women and girls will be the first to tell you that human rights are not Western, that there's something that we all share, regardless of our gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or any other point of identity. And I've learned in Afghanistan that the desire to learn in particular, that human right to read, to literacy, is something innate that cuts across cultures. And you may have heard in 2008, this was one of the few stories of attacks on the education system in Afghanistan that made it into Western media. There was a group of schoolgirls on their way to their morning classes in Kandahar one morning, I think it was around November of 2008, and a group of men on motorbikes who had been paid by the Taliban approached them and threw battery acid on them, disfiguring them, and they were hospitalized, about a dozen girls. 2 of them were blinded temporarily. And a week later, they were back in school. And there was an interview with one of the students, a 17-year-old named Shamsia, who had sustained severe eye injuries. And she was quoted as saying, "If they do this 100 times, I am still going back to school. My message for the enemies is this." And I think there's a crucial, crucial lesson in this. And it's that millions of brave Afghan schoolgirls are dedicated to their education, to learning, and that dedication is not imposed on them by anyone. It's homegrown and it's hearty. It's something that they have, and this really innate idea that they have it. They don't need anyone to tell them that they have rights, which is incidentally why I transitioned from working in the human rights sector to working in education, because I saw that women already knew that they had rights. And there were all these workshops going on in Afghanistan after the Taliban regime ended that were funded by donors that were intended to sort of tell women that they had rights and teach them about human rights. But they already knew. They just had lots of things standing in their way. And illiteracy and a lack of education was the main thing. So after I'd already done 2 degrees in fields totally unrelated to education, I weaseled my way into a literacy education program at UBC, and I was the only person without a Bachelor of Education or a Master's in Education and zero teaching experience. But I knew that literacy was the answer to human rights, and that's where I wanted to work, and that's where I've worked ever since. But back to cultural relativism, you'll find so many other examples, like those girls in Kandahar. I want to tell you about a man named Khan Muhammad, who was a principal of a girls' school in Logar province in eastern Afghanistan. And he received threats regularly from the Taliban telling him to shut the school down. And he ignored them, and every day just went to work. And he lost his life for it. One day they did kill him outside his house. And there was just a blip in a paper, just one paper about his murder. And there's Khan Muhammads all over Afghanistan. And they're positive deviants. And they make the way easier for others who come after them. They're trailblazers. And his story is a tragedy, but it was a triumph before it was a tragedy. And I know so many Khan Muhammads. There's 175,000 teachers that go to work every day in Afghanistan. And being a teacher is more like being a soldier in that country, because schools get burned down, teachers get murdered, principals have been beheaded, and parents are threatened for sending their daughters to school. But they keep going to school. And it's an incredible story that I think we're missing too often. We drown out those voices of people different from ourselves that tell us, perhaps inconveniently, I want the same things that you do. And sometimes we want to have this exoticism in the world, the idea that people are different from us, that there's complex, interesting places that we can kind of romanticize. But ultimately, we have more in common with people outside our own cultural milieu in other countries than we have apart. And above all else, we're human first, and we have to keep remembering that. And I have a theory about that, that why human rights are universal. It's not just something we've come up with in law. I think it's something that is truly scientific, actually, that's biological. And when I was so enraged, when I read about what was happening in 1996, I think I was responding how a child responds, with your biological capacity for empathy really intact. We all have that. We're born with it. Most neurologists believe that we have molecules like oxytocin that are responsible for triggering feelings of generosity, of charity, of trust. It's why you laugh when you see a baby, why we love our children, why we give money to charity sometimes. And so there's this morality that I think we're born with, that we don't create in our society. We come into our society with it, but we build a society with more or less morality than when we first arrived. And we have this biological capacity to relate to pain in others when we witness pain and suffering in other people. So when you see someone get a paper cut, you wince, right? Or if you see someone throwing up, or Leonardo DiCaprio drowning in the Titanic movie, we wince. And that's a natural reaction, and that helps us survive as a social group. It's in our biological interest for the people around us to be free of pain and suffering. But we witness pain and suffering every single day in the media around us. And I think when we read these stories, we have this alarm bell inside of us ringing, going off. And it's invasive and loud, and it's overwhelming, and it's hard to sort of take in all the suffering of other people. And so we have kind of a menu of options of how we can respond in witness of the pain of others. And one option, perhaps the most common, is just to ignore it, to block it out, because we just can't take it all in. A second option is to just feel overwhelming anger. And anger has its place too. I think it gets a bad rap. My whole career of activism has been fueled on anger. Anger makes really, really good fuel if you can channel it. And that brings us to the third option in the menu, and that's responding with empathy and action. And that's hard to do, but we must do that. Because if we don't, what we tend to do sometimes is the fourth option, which is to excuse our inaction. And cultural relativism is one of those excuses. And when we activate that excuse, when we say things like, it's their culture, I don't have any right to interfere, I've been told I'm neo-colonialist, Eurocentric, it's an Anglo-American enterprise, I'm imposing hegemonic discourse on others, I can give you a long list. When we activate these kinds of excuses for our inaction, we bring them into our society, into our institutions, into our politics, and it's very, very dangerous. And I think our non-interference can be just as dangerous as the Taliban's whips and guns. We've just done a really poor job in the developed world at large of standing up for the rights of others, especially for women and girls. But when we have tried to make change, when we have stood up aggressively, we have been able to make change. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, when different countries in the world had boycotts and campaigns, they made that regime look really, really unpopular. And I think those boycotts and the collective loudness of people's voices outside the borders of South Africa helped contribute to apartheid's downfall eventually. So we've got to shift our thinking and how we think about the rights of women and girls and have the same expectation for them that we have for ourselves. And it's not easy. You offend people sometimes. It's not always easy to be courageous and to say what you really think when everyone around you is saying something different. It's always easier to do nothing. So you have to go against the grain, and that's part of our responsibility as people witnessing the pain of others. And I'll just share one last story with you about the elections in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. Because I know that here, when you see election coverage in Afghanistan, it's mostly stories about the violence and the fraud and all the things that went wrong. But, and indeed, a lot of things did go wrong. As an aid worker there, I'm on a listserv of security alerts from an organization called the NGO Security Service, ANSO. And so in a typical day, we get about 20 ANSO alerts of security incidents going on in the country. So that's anything from rocket attacks, grenades, suicide bombings, kidnappings, assassinations, and so on. But on elections day, there were hundreds of them. They were literally coming into my inbox every minute or less, all day long. Grenades thrown into schools that were serving as polling stations, police who were trying to protect voters being murdered, election workers being murdered, bombings, and so on. And that's the story that made it into the press here. But the more extraordinary story was that millions of people went to the polls anyways, just like in the last elections. And so when I hear things here like, Afghans don't want democracy, that's a foreign idea, it's not natural for them, we're imposing it on them, all I can think is that there's nowhere else in the world that I've seen such a thirst for the right to vote as in Afghanistan, and people are dying to prove that. So what else do they have to do to give us the message that they want these same rights and privileges that we already have, and perhaps we've forgotten how hard the fight was? So I urge you, because we're all witnesses to the pain of others, to take up the obligation of speaking out, even when it's hard to do so, even when it's offensive to do so, and when it goes against the grain to do so. So thank you very much, and have a great day.